Hello everyone and welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi, Bava Kamma Daf 74a. It's finishing off from the last onward. It's possible that by discussing a case where a second set of witnesses both reverse the order of events, by testifying that the tooth was knocked out before blinding of the eye, and at the same time render the first set of witnesses as complying witnesses by testifying that those original witnesses were not at the scene of the supposed events they claim to have witnessed. It can be argued, albeit in a far-fetched manner, that the testimony in the first set of witnesses is considered to be to the master's advantage, even at this stage, because he knows what really happened, as reflected in the testimony of the latter witnesses. Accordingly, Rava maintains that there was a total of 3 sets of witnesses in the case of the Braita, while Abai says that there were only 2 sets. Abai elaborates, from where do I say that my interpretation of the Braita is correct? From the fact that the latter clause of the Braita states a ruling with regard to a case in which the second set of witnesses both reverse the order of events and render the first pair as conspiring witnesses. It may be inferred that the first case as well, in parallel fashion, states a ruling with regard to a case in which the second set of witnesses both reverses the order of events and render the first pair as conspiring witnesses. This is as it teaches in the latter clause of the Braita, that if witnesses say, we testify with regard to so-and-so that he knocked out his Canaanite slave's tooth and afterward blinded his eye, which required the master to emancipate him and compensate him for the value of his eye, as that is what the slave says, i.e. this testimony is advantageous to the slave, and subsequently they were found to be conspiring witnesses, they pay the value of the eye to the master. Abai analyzes this clause of the Braita. What are the circumstances of this case? If it is speaking of a situation where the latter set of witnesses who attest to the first set of witnesses were conspiring witnesses, do not concede that there was any injury at all inflicted on the slave by his master, then there is no testimony to confirm that those injuries were inflicted other than that given by the witnesses who were shown to be conspiring witnesses. Consequently, they should be required to pay the entire value of the slave to the master, as this is the amount of monetary damage the master stood to incur as a result of their false testimony. Rather, it is obvious that all of them, i.e. both the first set of witnesses and the latter set, concede with regard to the injury inflicted on the slave by the master. They both agree that the master both blinded the slave's eye and knocked out his tooth, and therefore is obligated to emancipate him. They disagree concerning only the order of events. The first set of witnesses said that the tooth injury occurred first, and the eye injury occurred afterward. Consequently, they sought to require the master to emancipate the slave and compensate him for the eye injury. And the second set of witnesses reversed the order of the events, and in their testimony saying that the eye injury took place first, and that in the same testimony they rendered the first pair conspiring witnesses. So what does the footnote say? Udka ashchinen ba'az minhu. And they reversed and rendered the first pair conspiring witnesses. It's impossible to explain this latter clause of the Braita as involving 3 sets of witnesses in a manner parallel to Rava's explanation of the first clause. The hypothetical case would be as follows. A first set of witnesses testifies that the master initially inflicted an eye injury and then a tooth injury, which means that the master must emancipate the slave and compensate him for the value of his tooth. An immediate set testifies that the tooth injury preceded the eye injury, requiring the master to emancipate the slave and to compensate him for the value of his eye. Since the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses contradicts that of the first set, the testimony that results in the master's paying for the injury of less monetary value will be accepted, in which case is the version that the eye injury occurred first. If so, the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses had no effect at all on the judgment as it stood after the testimony of the first set. Ultimately, the third set of witnesses arrives and testifies that the intermediate set were not at the scene of the purported events, rendering them conspiring witnesses. The problem with this interpretation is that there is a principle that conspiring witnesses are not punished in a testimony that did not lead to a verdict in court. Since in this case the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses had no effect on the judgment, they would not incur any punishment at all, even if they were rendered conspiring witnesses. Rava would agree that the case of the latter clause of the Braita involves merely 2 sets of witnesses, with the second set both contradicting the first set and rendering the first set conspiring witnesses. Abai's argument is that since the latter clause of the Braita must be interpreted in this fashion, it is reasonable to assume that the first clause should be interpreted in a similar manner, says Rashi, by testifying that they were present when the events occurred. Since the latter clause of the Brisa must be interpreted in this manner, it stands to reason that the first case should be explained similarly. The Gemara analyzes the Braisa's interpretation of the Brisa, and what are the circumstances of the case. The second set of witnesses who are deemed credible have established that the injuries did not take place on the date reported by the first set of witnesses. According to their testimony, when did the injuries take place? If the latter witnesses post-dated the events by testifying that the injuries were actually inflicted at a later stage, that mentioned by the first set of witnesses, the first set of witnesses should still be required to pay the full value of a slave to the master. The reason the first set of witnesses should be liable is that when they sought to impose liability upon the man by the master, this man was not yet burdened with any liability. When the first set of witnesses testified about the injuries, the master was not yet obligated to emancipate his slave or pay damages. Therefore, these conspiring witnesses should be required to pay these sums, which they had sought to impose on the master. Rather, it must be that the latter set of witnesses predated the time of the injuries by testifying that they inflicted at an earlier date than that attested to by the first set of witnesses. The Gemara continues to analyze the case, and if the Brisa is referring to a case where the master had not yet stood trial for having injured his slave, when the first set of witnesses submitted their testimony, those witnesses should still be required to pay the entire value of the slave. Achati demei kulei eved v'chulu. Two witnesses testify that a man committed murder on a particular day in a particular place. Subsequently, two other witnesses rendered the first set of conspiring witnesses by testifying that those witnesses were in a different place at the time of the purported crime. Even if the second set of witnesses add that the accused did in fact commit the murder on a different day, conspiring witnesses are liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment, even if that different day is earlier than the day claimed by the conspiring witnesses. The reason is that at the time they submitted their testimony, the accused had not yet been convicted. That's in the Rambam Sefer Shovat Mehilchot Eidet 19:2. So the master, as at the time of their testimony, the man, the master, was not yet liable. The achiti gavalo michayev. Although the actions for which the master must pay compensation had already occurred before the testimony, the Gemara states that he has no liability as of yet. Rashi explains that this is because one who admits that he has performed an act that is punishable by a fine is not required to pay that fine. As long as no testimony had been submitted against a guilty party, he can avoid liability by admitting his guilt. Others explain that unlike in the case of debt and monetary obligations, one is not considered to owe the fine at all, even after he has committed a punishable act. Since a fine by definition is not commensurate with one's actions, he is liable to pay the fine only when the court sentences him to do so. And that's from Tosfot. The first set of witnesses sought to render the master liable at a time when he was exempt from liability, and therefore they should be obligated to pay him the full value of the slave. Rather, it must be that the master had already stood trial. The Amad Badin. The master already stood trial. Two witnesses testify that a certain person was convicted of a capital crime by a particular court on a particular day, and subsequently other witnesses render the first set of witnesses conspiring witnesses, i.e. they testify that those witnesses were in a different place at a time of the reported conviction. The second set of witnesses adds that the accused was convicted on a previous day. The conspiring witnesses are not punished. The reason is that the accused was already convicted man at the time when these witnesses submitted a testimony. That's the Rambam Sefer Shovat Mehilchot Eidet 19:2. For having inflicted these injuries and had been sentenced by the court to emancipate the slave for the first injury and pay him for the second injury. Then the master evaded payment and was subsequently brought before another court, where the witnesses testified that the first court had established liability for knocking out the tooth first and then blinding the slave's eye. This testimony was subsequently rendered conspiring testimony by a second set of witnesses, who testified both that the first set of witnesses was not at the scene of the first trial, and that the results of the trial were actually reversed, i.e. the master's liability was for blinding the eye first and then for knocking out the tooth. Since the first set of witnesses who were rendered conspiring witnesses sought to increase the master's liability payment from that of the value of a tooth to that of an eye, they must pay the value of an eye to the master. Rava sought to infer from this Brisa to his opinion that contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony. Rabbi son of Rav Ika said to Rav Ashi, from which case in the Brisa is the inference of Rava? If we say that his inference is from the first clause, this is difficult. In the case of the first clause, if it involves three sets of witnesses claimed by Rava, as the intermediate set of witnesses contradicted and rejected before they are established as conspiring witnesses, the first set of witnesses testified that the eye injury took place after the tooth injury, whereas the intermediate set of witnesses reversed the order. If so, the intermediate set of witnesses sought to lower the master's payment from the value of an eye to that of a tooth. Rav continues, since if the second set of witnesses would not have been rendered conspiring witnesses, the testimony would have been established in accordance with their statement, as the judgment would not have been decided in accordance with their testimony. The reason their testimony would have determined the ruling is that 100 dinars is subsumed within 200. A testimony concerning a larger sum includes testimony concerning a smaller sum. Rav continues, therefore, it is the first set of witnesses who testified that an eye injury occurred last, whose testimony would be considered contradicted and rejected, whereas the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses would not be considered contradicted at all, as it is accepted in full. If so, this is not a case of witnesses who were rejected due to contradiction and then subsequently rendered conspiring witnesses. Rav Ashi said to Rav in response, Rava maintains that from the fact that the ruling of the first clause of the Bryce is stated with regard to a case involving three sets of witnesses, it is logical to assume that the ruling of the latter clause is also stated with regard to a case involving three sets of witnesses, and Rava infers his ruling from the latter clause. Rava explains that the latter clause is referring to a case where two witnesses, i.e. the ones mentioned in the Bryce, come and say the master knocked out the slave's tooth and afterward blinded his eye, and the court ruled its judgment in accordance with their statement, obligating the master to emancipate his slave and compensate him for the value of his eye. And subsequently, two other witnesses who are not mentioned in the Baita come and say that the events were reversed. First, the master blinded his slave's eye and then knocked out his tooth, so that they contradict the testimony of those first witnesses. At this point, the master is obligated to emancipate his slave and pay him only for the value of his tooth, as this much was required of him according to both sets of witnesses, and then the first pair were found to be conspiring witnesses. Therefore, the Baita states the first set of witnesses pays the value of an eye to the master less the value of a tooth. Rava reaches a conclusion based on the following reasoning. And if it enters your mind that the contradiction of testimony is not the start of determining the testimony's conspiring testimony, and witnesses who first contradicted and then rendered conspiring witnesses are not punished as conspiring witnesses, why must these witnesses pay? They were already contradicted from the outset, before they were shown to be conspiring witnesses. But they conclude from the latter clause of the Baita that the contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony. We see that in the footnote. Contradictory testimony and determining conspiring testimony. There are several differences between these two forms of disqualifying the testimony of witnesses. A pair of witnesses are rendered conspiring witnesses if a second pair testifies that they could not have witnessed the events in question because they were not in the place where the incident purportedly transpired. Witnesses are rendered conspiring witnesses. Witnesses who are rendered conspiring witnesses receive the same punishment they sought to have it imposed on the individual concerning whom they testified. In a case concerning contradictory testimony, two other witnesses simply state a different version of events. Although the first pair of witnesses is suspected of lying, they are not disqualified from testifying in other cases, and they receive no punishment. In this case, the testimony of each pair of witnesses carries equal weight. Consequently, the two testimonies neutralize one another. How could Abaye disagree with Rava refute this proof? How could he say to granted it is impossible to interpret the first clause without the supposition that there are three sets of witnesses involved? The reason is that it is taught with regard to the first clause, as that is what the master says. This testimony is satisfactory to the master. The only testimony recorded in the Baita is that the master blinded the slave's eye and then knocked out his tooth. Why would this be considered satisfactory to the master? It must therefore be assumed that this testimony was preceded by another one which is even less advantageous to the master. That testimony confirmed the injuries but placed the eye injury after the tooth injury, which involves greater liability for the master. Finally, a third set of witnesses must have arrived and rendered the intermediate set as conspiring witnesses, so that there are a total of three sets of witnesses. But with regard to the latter clause, why do I need to explain it as referring to three sets of witnesses? If you say that it is because the Baita states concerning this case as that is what the slave says, i.e. this testimony is satisfactory to the slave, this does not prove that there is another testimony not mentioned in the Brisa that is less favorable to the slave than this one. The reason is that a slave would say anything, i.e. any form of testimony would be favorable to him, and this is satisfactory for him, and he should be emancipated. The court's acceptance of testimony confirming either order of events would result in his emancipation from slavery, and therefore both testimonies are satisfactory to him. Although there is a compelling reason to posit the existence of three sets of witnesses in the first clause, there is no justification to do so in the second clause, and therefore it should be explained as did Abaye as discussing only two sets of witnesses. Rabbi Zeir objects to the basic assumption of the Braita that when a master inflicts two injuries upon his Canaanite slave, he must indemnify the slave for the second injury. One can say instead that if the master blinded his slave's eye, the slave should go free on account of his eye, and if he knocked out his tooth, he should go free on account of his tooth, and if the master both blinded his eye and knocked out his tooth, the slave should go free on account of both his eye and his tooth, without the master having to pay damages for the loss of his tooth. That's the end of the Omid. Thank you for listening, and all the best. Bye.